Hi, everyone, and welcome to another issue of the Ancient Warfare podcast. And this time we are discussing the latest issue of the magazine, 17.4, on the end of the Persian Wars, or the Persian Wars Part 2. And joining me on the panel today are Lindsay Powell, Mark McCaffrey, and Mark DeSantis. And I'm Murray Dahm, the assistant editor of the magazine. Jasper is exhausted and having the night off. So here we are. The cat's away. The boys will play. And we're going to talk about the end of the Persian Wars, which is a very peculiar way to talk about the Persian Wars because we did an earlier issue of the magazine which looked at the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis, for instance, taking us down to 480 BC. And this one, we specifically said not those, but from that point onwards. And so looking not just at obviously the cumulative year of 479 with the Battle of Plataea and Mycale, but the other aspects of the Persian Wars, which don't really get a lot of media because most people will talk about the Persian Wars as being 480 to 479, and it ends with the Battle of Plataea. And that misses out a whole bunch of very intriguing history. Later historians will talk about what's called the 50-year period, the Pentacontiatia, which is the beginning of Thucydides' history, which traces that 50 years since the end of the Persian Wars until the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. And so it's in that area that you get a complex series of campaigns and machinations of politics and other things going on in the Aegean, where the Greeks basically make it into a Greek sea rather than it being a Persian sea. So that's what the issue looked at. So there's all sorts of articles in there that are not your normal fare for a Persian Wars examination, which is interesting in itself. Is there any aspect of it that you think we didn't cover or that we could have covered that we did differently from how you would expect it?
I think there is mention in a number of the articles in the magazine this time around in terms of the source problems, and we're always talking about source problems, of course, but in terms of, you already mentioned Thucydides and the Pentacontiatia, and the fact that in terms of our information about this period, we are reliant on sources like Thucydides, but at the same time, Thucydides his focus is actually more forward into the later period when you've got the rise of the Peloponnesian War conflict, and labeling this period as the if you like, the pot that's boiling over with the issues that will eventually spill over and cause that conflict. And with that in mind, a number of these conflicts during this period after, I'm almost tempted to sort of say after the Persian Wars, because you think of the end of the Persian Wars as Plataea most of the time, and most of the texts modern texts that deal with it, they'll end with Plataea. Even Mycale won't get as much of a mention in most of the books that we have, and so from that period on, it gets it's a how can I say, it's a fairly rough deal in terms of the coverage, because our sources are so focused on what's coming next, and for them, that's the Peloponnesian War.
I think it's a peculiar, like Thucydides especially, is hindsight history. All of this led to this, and you're like, well, did it? Is it inevitable? I remember there was an examination question once of, was the Athenian Empire inevitable? And of course, one of the factors in this period is the creation of the Delian League after Plataea and Mycale, where they create this league that's going to be navally based to keep the Aegean free from Persian fleets. And of course, you can contribute ships or money or both. And Sparta famously withdraws from it and becomes insular within the Peloponnese again, and it then devolves into an Athenian empire as Athens, who was the major contributor from the start, starts to forcibly make island states join the Delian League. And if you try and rebel, they will, invade, eliminate your government, and insert a democracy. It sounds far more modern than ancient Greece. It's a democracy that you must have as your government if we're to trust you, and we'll expel all the oligarchs. And then, of course, you get the final step is the moving of the treasury from Delos after Chimon's abortive Egyptian campaign, that is Delos threatened by a resurgent Persia. Therefore, let's move the treasury of the Delian League to Athens. Oh, it's ours. Great. Fabulous. It's now an Athenian empire.
But again, this is all getting overly done in terms of Athens, isn't it? In terms of the focus is totally there.
Yeah. And it's a hindsight. Oh, this happened, therefore it was inevitable, as opposed to looking at, and I mean, especially Athenian politics always was and remains a expedient, in the moment discussion. Oh, this is the response. And sometimes those responses, the other option that, was only narrowly avoided is generally a polar opposite response, not a slightly similar, only in the details that it differ response. It's this or that. And we went with that. Well, sorry, this. But you could have easily gone with that. And it was a demagogue or a persuasive speech by whoever that made you go one way or the other. And to treat that as if it was this path was always destined, it was like at any point in Greek politics, it could have gone in completely the other direction. And so I think looking at it as this sort of expediency and, reactive rather than planning. And I think that's one of the other things about Greek politics in general, that Pericles, for instance, seems to have had a premeditated plan. But after his death, it's abandoned, especially after Sphacteria. And the weird thing is that you can't then see a premeditated plan in it, but people like to, because the idea that this is all random and we're just reacting to whatever's going on is something that we still can't see in politics today. We have to have a plan. There has to be a plan. It can't just be, I'm here, whatever comes at me, I'll react to it, and then we'll write the history of it later, and it'll be turned into a cohesive plan, which I think is what happens in Greek history. And, people like Thucydides and Herodotus are guilty of it. And the fascinating thing is when one mentions something that the other does not. So, as you say, Thucydides is writing a history of the lead up to the Peloponnesian War, and there are events which may have been important in this end of the Persian Wars idea in Greece that he doesn't mention in his inevitable conflict between Sparta and Athens. And, Herodotus is writing, we think, in around 440 down to the 420s. And so he's referring to some of these events. He's flashing forward in some cases to events. I think the latest event Herodotus mentions is something in around 432. So we've got this idea that he's referring to something very late. And so the idea that the Persian Wars were not definitively finished in that moment is something that some of the Greek historians recognize. And, they come down to things like the Peace of Callias. And I know Mark DeSantis was talking about that, and we don't even know when that happens. And we don't even know. We don't even know if it happens. We don't even know when it happens. And if it happened when, what was it? And you're like, what?
But in all these events that you're talking about, we're missing a major character, aren't we? We're missing the Persian king. I mean, if you go back to the Persian Wars as such, yes, you've got Xerxes present in Greece for the end of the, what we traditionally think of the Persian Wars in terms of up to Salamis, and then off he goes home. The last we sort of hear of him in the Greek sources really is his appearance in that wonderful play, The Persiae, from Aeschylus. And of course, from that point on, the dismay of going home and having to face the home crowd, he disappears from our sources. And you mentioned the Peace of Callias. We don't really have an idea of, is that really Persian policy enacted, or is this Greek propaganda? You've got the likes of the rise of Pericles and the change from the Delian League into the Athenian Empire eventually, and that all being driven by this phantom in the background, which nobody mentions, and we don't really know what's going on there.
To look at the role of Persia after the end of the Persian Wars, it would certainly seem that whether they were willing to allow some sort of not free reign, but more freedom of action to Athens. That is, they were willing to take a lighter hand on the edge of the empire and allow the Athenians to consolidate whatever you were going to call the League of Delos into an empire. They had more or less a light touch on the periphery of the empire in other areas. They were willing to maybe towards India and towards the Central Asia. So I could see how, I'm not saying that the Peace of Callias was real, but I could see how that they would allow some sort of like a gray zone ambivalence or ambiguous nature to their overlordship. That is, they never gave up the concept of their overlordship, but maybe the fact that the tribute was no longer going to Persia just for the time being, because decades later, when Persia decided to return to the Aegean, that is with funding, not Persian troops, to support the Peloponnesians in a big way. They bankrolled several Peloponnesian fleets again and again because they were upset with the Athenians because of the Athenian support for I think it was Amorgus, that is who was a rebellious satrap. Really, the Athenian Empire in many ways was because the Athenians had pulled back, and whether that was because it was not a vital theater for Persia, which had interests all over the world, or the Persian world, or just the character of the Persian king, who was not interested in a continued conflict in that area.
I think it's interesting that if you go in a slightly different direction as well, taking into consideration, you're saying, are the Persians, pulling out of that area altogether, or what is their policy? Look at Macedon at the time. The rise of Macedon during this period is I think a direct result of Persia pulling back, because up until then Persia had quite an influence on the Macedonian kingship at that time. And then after the Persian Wars, you've got more of a development of Macedonian independence in that area, being able to expand into Thrace, for example, without Persian interference. And the next time you hear about the Persians in Macedon, it's not the official Persian officials as such. It is people who are temporarily exiled from the Persian court who are seeking residence in the Macedonian court. So subsequently, Persia has totally withdrawn from that element of its Western policy.
Which is a bit like the opposite of what we hear when, Athenians get exiled and they go into Persia. When Persians get exiled, they come into Macedon and other parts of Greece. But I think it's that fascinating aspect of the history that obviously the Persian sources don't mention it. And so therefore, was it unimportant? Is it just the silence of the Persian sources? It happened externally to the Persian Empire, essentially the Persian Wars. It was expansion, yes, but it didn't happen. Therefore, the empire did not shrink really. And that, of course, is with the Peace of Callias. Are they really going to restrict their own power in the way that the phraseology of the Peace of Callias and Plutarch and Diodorus says? Very unlikely they would agree that they wouldn't go to places.
What are these Persian sources?
Well, we've got several inscriptions. We've got several later historians who are themselves Greek, especially Callias, who are at the Persian court and seem to report Persian perspectives. They're much later. Callias is there during the late 5th century. But, several of the inscriptions, and then they go quiet, and you've got other things, but they don't mention it. But they aren't writing historical narratives in the sense that, they're not running a continuous narrative in the way that Herodotus does and then Thucydides.
No, I just think it's very interesting because everybody probably like me who has a passing knowledge of the Persian Wars instantly thinks of Herodotus, and some of the other derivatives from him probably don't think that there are any sources at all from Persia. So it's actually a revelation to me that you tell me this.
There's been a movement in recent scholarship to look at Persian sources, and often, you're forced to make an argument from silence because that's all there is, but not a passive silence in a way that, we are forced often to make arguments from silence because the sources that we know existed have ceased to exist either through destruction or a lack of survival. Whereas I think in the Persian sense, there is, until the death of Xerxes in 465, very much a don't mention the war kind of idea that actually it wasn't important. Yes, you didn't add to the empire, but we haven't contracted the empire. They still appoint satraps to Ionia and all of those regions that supposedly, according to the later Greek version of the history, are Greek now. There's still a Persian satrap in place there. So how Greek is it if you've got a Persian satrap demanding tribute from cities that are supposedly free? And so you get a sort of like, but hang on, your narrative's telling me this. We know from coinage and other aspects that the king is writing a letter to the satrap of Ionia. How is there a satrapy of Ionia if Ionia is now independent? And I think some of the big phrases that you get after the Battle of Cyprus and Salamis, which is 451 BC, and supposedly after that you get the Peace of Callias, according to one version of the chronology. The Greeks are led by Athens, but they are ensuring the independence of Greek cities in the Aegean, and as far as the Hellespont and into the Black Sea. So that kind of big phrase of we will guarantee your independence sounds great on paper, sounds amazing in a historian. In reality, yeah, well, we might put a ship.
In reality, they're looking after their own interests, basically. In terms,
we might row a ship. Yeah.
The Athenians have their eyes very firmly set on the Black Sea and their grain trade that is going up through there, that is a major supply to them personally. And okay, they've got a little bit of grain coming in from Egypt at the time, but the Black Sea is a much safer bet for them. So again, we're looking at a lot of this through Athenian eyes.
Yeah. And I think again, coming back to the terms of the peace, according to where it's very unlikely the Persians are going to restrict their own movement. They're not going to put a limit on, we won't go past this place and nor will you. Because again, that limit doesn't quite work. Is it a river? Is it an island? There are several differing interpretations of where this was. But those interpretations imply that it's a treaty, as opposed to a vague kind of gentleman's agreement between the satraps of Cyprus and the Athenian general at the time, which is then ratified and supposedly onto an inscription, an Athenian inscription.
Maybe the parties accepted the status quo as whatever, however they wanted to interpret it as, and it was more or less an armistice, and that was how they did it. They left it vague deliberately.
And I think it's also unlikely to have been, it was an agreement between the victorious Athenian general and the Persian satraps he defeated. And that didn't get ratified by either government or the king, for instance. But, it's sort of given to us as a fait accompli. But it's odd because, of course, Athenian aggressiveness, how likely is it that Athens wins a naval battle in Cyprus and then says, yes, but we'll have our border way back here? You're like, that's not Athenian. That would be like, no, here. We have all of this coast because we've won this far, And even the Battle of Eurymedon, which again is 469, but is it 469? Sorry, yes, is that the right day? Yes, 469 or 466, 465. We're not sure. That's how vague some of this history is, that, it's in this period of 5 years, we think, maybe, if it happened at all, like with the Peace of Callias. And the Battle of Eurymedon is, again, a sort of combined battle of both a sea battle and a land battle. And that's halfway down the Anatolian coast where the Eurymedon is, and that becomes like, this is the extent of Athenian/Greek influence. But again, all of that area west of that river is still claimed by Persian satrapies. So it's a very hard thing to definitively say this is what happened.
And you don't necessarily know the strength of those navies that are going around at this time in all these battles as well. What are the strengths after Salamis? The Persians are on the retreat, but what does that exactly mean? What shipbuilding is going on at the time? The Phoenicians later withdrawing their services from the Persian fleet. The Athenians are making their way across the Aegean, but with what? And considering that Salamis was a big allied fleet, exactly, okay, yes, you've got the money coming in from the Delian League, but again, that means that you've got active shipbuilding going on, but at the same time, you've got maintenance of ships. How many ships are going out of service at this time? Because they've got a limited amount of lifespan with these wooden ships. There's a lot of variables in terms of exactly how strong are these fleets running around and what are the ups and downs of those strengths?
One of the other things, of course, is how long does a rower last? There's the manpower of these fleets is something that, they're not featured in the histories. They're not hoplites. They're rowers. So when they come off the boats, they fight as psiloi, when they fight at all. And then we get the idea that, they're slaves. No, they're not. They're citizen rowers. And so, but how long can you stay at the benches of a trireme as an effective? And if that is a quick turnover of manpower, how long does it take to train a new fleet, a new crew? So all of these, these things are unknown, really.
And of course, the trireme is, how can I say, at the mercy of the weather. So in terms of how much of the campaigning season is there in each of these years throughout this period that a fleet is going to be effectively enforcing dominion over certain areas. So in that case, it could be a very, highly influx situation of who is, where does that border lie? That might lie behind some of this idea that there is a peace of some sort, because actually it's, there are so many other elements that come into it.
Well, I wonder so the temptation is to think of borders as being hard lines on maps like we in the 21st century think of them, as opposed to zones of permeable dispute, and people can claim things on both sides because, that's just how the reality is.
Mind you, again, we think of them as hard borders, and then we discover in contemporary history that actually these borders are not hard. They're, they were invented, some of them very recently, some others change. They change hands quite permeably, even right now. And, when you look at the end of World War II, or at the end of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, for instance, those borders change. And so you now have a pocket where nations that never existed or ceased to exist at some point in the past exist again. And the bizarre thing about a lot of those is that the identities of the people were at one point absorbed and then became reasserted. So, when you look at those former Yugoslavian countries now, they're all national independence movements that were never apparently nations, but then suddenly this nation emerges with a wholly consistent national identity, and you're like, but weren't you part of? Oh, that's odd.
But I was also thinking in terms of like zones of influence. So, for example, in the way that I remind you, for example, Augustus actually, when he's talking in his Res Gestae, is referring to British kings and kings in other parts of the world as being clients of his. So, in his vision of the world, Britain was kind of within the influence of the Roman Empire, even though there weren't troops in there. I just wonder if that's an ancient mindset, which is if you resist the temptation, there's a hard line on a map. Actually, our influence goes way beyond that, because, like you said, you've got the derricks and the coins going out in this trade and all this sort of thing going on as well.
I think it's very good for a pretext and a justification of war if you've got a zone of influence. Just ask the Romans in the Second Punic War, for instance. But again, that's not. When you look at the imperialism of the 20th century, zones of influence still exist. Greater prosperity spheres, we might call them. That idea. And even during the Cold War, you had areas rather than, and of course, obviously, with the existence rather than sea power, which we still got, of air power. The idea that this zone beyond this country's borders, extending 200 kilometers, is their airspace. Even in the recent days, there has been violation of airspace, which is, again, zones of influence rather than a hard line on a map.
Just goes to your point earlier, which is it's actually very hard to know because actually both sides can claim that they own the territory, and in fact the reality is very much more muddied.
From the Persian perspective, at the time, let's say it's the mid 5th century BC, and there's some sort of agreement, armistice, to accept the status quo. Was anything that was happening with the Athenians in the Aegean to be considered either a threat to the Persian Empire or a mortal threat to the Persian Empire? And I would say, really, a threat, very limited. Mortal threat, no. So I could see why they might take a hands-off approach and allow the boundaries to be fuzzy. That is, the Athenians at that time were not a threat to them. Now, remember, the Persian Wars were apparently started because the Athenians had taken part in the attack on Sardis. Okay, and the initial Persian invasion was revenge. That was based upon revenge for the Athenian participation in the attack on Sardis. Whatever was happening by the 5th century BC, it doesn't look like the Athenians were attacking the Persians directly. And it was only when the Athenians somehow got involved with Amorgus in around 420 BC. That's when the Persians came in and strength and started bankrolling the Peloponnesians.
Yeah, well, you get the Egyptian expedition, which is the Athenians meddling in Persian affairs peripherally. The Egyptians are revolting. There's a civil war in Egypt to stay with Persia or break away. The Athenians send an army that is initially successful and then disastrously defeated. And that again comes to the terminology of this piece of Callias, that the vague phraseology of the Athenians and the Greeks will not venture beyond a certain point is about don't meddle, and we won't meddle, and you won't meddle, kind of vagaries. But as you say, not a mortal threat. And I wonder whether the Persian perspective is we've got other fish to fry, we've got other things to deal with within the Persian Empire, which is still vast and enormous. And that expedition that, let's face it, did what it was required to do, which was to punish the two cities that had sacked Sardis in 495, Athens and Eretria. Both got burned, both got punished. Yes, we lost a fleet. Yes, we lost an army, but I'm the Persian king. They were all slaves. I can replace those. I've got a new one. And I think the fascinating thing from a military perspective is there does not seem to have been any reform in Persian military equipment, fighting style, armies. What we find later under Alexander is similarly described, similar to Cunaxa by Xenophon. The only of evolution is the Kardakis, which we're not sure when that happens, which is what essentially looks like a Persian hoplite, where they seem to want to equip a Persian infantryman like a Greek heavy infantryman, as opposed to what we would think, which would be you fought the Battle of Marathon, you fought the Battle of Thermopylae, you fought the Battle of Plataea. These Greek hoplites are far superior to your Persian infantrymen. Why wouldn't you then go, well, let's model ourselves on the thing that defeated us and therefore we'll be stronger? And that doesn't happen. And so that is in a way a testament to they did not see this as an existential crisis to the army and the empire that had built the Persian Empire.
The Persians themselves, being so wealthy, could always hire Greek hoplite mercenaries to fill that gap, as they did, as the same way as that they had access to fantastic heavy cavalry from Bactria and Sogdia. So that is whatever they may have lacked as Persians, they could always make up for from some other part of the empire. So that is, they may have seen themselves as remedying anything. So simply by bringing them into the service directly.
Getting back to Murray's point, in terms of are we looking at this all from a Greek perspective, I was going to argue, because if you go to, take Herodotus and his description of the great Persian army that marches past and all 7 million of them, or whatever he wants to describe, the nations of the world walking past, in reality, there's probably more of a core of the army which is made up of your Medians, your Kissians and the Persians, and yes, in terms of some cavalry from Bactria and Sogdiana, maybe a couple of Indians, but actually it's not a representation of every element. And I think that comes back to, that the Persian identity, and whether they'd want to sully the Persian identity by adapting and bringing in somebody else's, especially Greek ideas, into the Persian army and adapting it. Maybe that's, us saying that is more saying, oh, well, the Greeks are so good, why can't the Persians realize this? But the Persians are saying, no, we are Persians. That's what we do.
Absolutely. And I think, and again, the reality is that the Persian military system isn't shown to be utterly fallible until Alexander. But what it seems is that it's the same system for the next 150 years. The Persians have kept this army that has made them their empire. And I think you're probably right. It's probably a core of central troops with some mercenary peripherals, but not the polyglot army that we get described by Herodotus. Fascinating though it is. Yeah, but again, we're having to argue from silence because our points of reference are few and far between.
If we could know what was going on in detail in the Persian Empire in that period, roughly from the end of the Battle of Mycale to when they came back in force.
Yeah, again, well, I think there's several things. One, of course, you've got the King's Peace in 386 BC, where the Persian king, Artaxerxes II, is meddling in Greek affairs to the extent that he's brokering a peace between Greek empires. And of course, you've got the Persian king meddling in Greek affairs during the last phase of the Peloponnesian War. So that idea that they're not interested is clearly false. They're still around. They're still, buying influence and sending through emissaries. So it's not this cut and dry and now it ends that we would like to think it was in the histories. It's a permeable barrier in both directions. You've got Greeks going to Persia and you've got Persians going to Greek.
Might be worth thinking also about earlier in the Persian Wars, when you have, of course, the campaign of Darius, and then you have that gap between that and Xerxes, because you've got that change of leadership, and there's going to be that transitional period which takes place, and sometimes that can lead to uncertainty. And we see that gap in the earlier Persian Wars. Maybe we're not taking consideration of that when you get, okay, yes, Xerxes is around for some time after the likes of Plataea and Mycale, but there is going to be a transitional period between Xerxes and Artaxerxes coming in, and there's going to be, the feuds within court. You've going to have uprisings or disturbances at various points of the empire. Again, you mentioned silences. Well, another silence that we might be missing.
Right. Succession crises that actually delay or impede any sort of more forceful attention to the.
I mean, again, the Greek sources would tell us that it's all domestic court intrigues that dominate the Persian Empire. And queens and rival emperors, and we generally think of that with Cyrus and Artaxerxes II. But you've got succession issues. Xerxes II's reign only lasts 45 days in 424 BC. Sogdianus, who replaces him's reign, lasts 6 months before he's replaced by Darius II. So it's a very kind of like solid rule. And one of the things about the Persian Empire is we tend to focus on its defeat And we tend to make those defeats into enormous defeats. So we make the Persian Wars the defeat of the Persian Empire. It's more the blunting of an expansion program. They haven't really defeated anything. It's not till Alexander that the Persian Empire gets defeated. But, yes, there's not a immediate loss of a foreign campaign which leads to the toppling of the kingship. Even the individual king is not replaced or done away with at the end of the first, as you said, Mark, Darius doesn't get toppled in 490. Similarly, Xerxes does not get toppled after what we see.
Despite what Aeschylus wants to say to us.
Yeah, absolutely. He's not killed until 465, and then his successor rules into 424. So huge reigns that we see from a Greek perspective as being multi-zoned in terms of, this phase, is in fact encapsulated by a single Persian king, which is, again, one of the issues with the way we look at history from a Greek perspective, and we turn it into, the encapsulating of it and compartmentalizing of it is a Greek thing. In fact, on the other side of the Aegean is that reign, and completely changes how you would compartmentalize it. And it's interesting with the death of Queen Elizabeth II and now King Charles III, but also American presidents and, different cultures, different kings, different prime ministers, all of those things change how you look at a particular period of history. And we're still stuck with it, even though we use a generally regularized dating system now. And of course, there are multiple dating systems in the world today, depending on what culture you're from. But if you look at the reign of Elizabeth II, 52 to 23, that's a phase that in the ancient world we would look at as a single event, whether it be the reign of Augustus or whether it be, an Egyptian pharaoh. That so much happened in that phase, in that reign. It's very hard for us today to go, the reign of Elizabeth II covers all of this stuff. Or the life of Elizabeth II, because that brings in World War II. But all of that's very tricky to put from that one perspective. But that's how most things were done in the ancient world. So if you divide the Persian Wars into the reigns of Persian kings, they are blips on a radar. They are not monumental events. They are, this happened, wasn't successful. I went over and I did this, I did this. Oh yeah, I did that, didn't work, but that's okay. I went and did this then. Whereas from that Greek perspective, it's the defense of Hellas against it's the freedom versus slavery perspective, which is the Greek perspective, as opposed to the Persian perspective, which we tend not to have. But it doesn't disappear.
I wonder, Mary, whether in fact, because we in the West look at Herodotus as being the father of history, that's actually had a profound impact on how we look at history. But what you just basically described there is we think of eras, right? So the Elizabethan era, right? Queen Elizabeth I. I guess what we're now going to call this is the Carolinian era if we're British, or whatever the equivalent would be in a post-Cold War world or something like that. But it's for the convenience of historians, isn't it, to be able to wrap this thing with the title, to be able to put on a book. And then you contrive to have all of these things somehow all interrelate to that time period. But in fact, the great sweeps that lead, the trends that lead to those conflicts or whatever the diplomatic struggles are, in fact, go well beyond the confines of that particular era. But we actually blame Herodotus for it.
Even centuries don't work. We love to talk about what happened in the 20th century, but what happens at the beginning of the 20th century is all down to what was happening in the 19th century. So in fact, the 20th century, there's people who talk about the 19th century doesn't end until 1924. And, the 20th century really doesn't begin until the 20s. And you're like, wait, what? Because it's sort of like that convenient 100-year period, or in Thucydides' term, 50-year period, actually doesn't work. There's not a real sort of definitive closing line, which we want there to be. It's easy to define. And obviously the regnal years of a particular monarch are an easy, but, again, what was happening in Elizabeth II's reign has continued beyond her death and had begun before her birth and before her reign. So it also doesn't really work. But then there are those emperors where it does. If you take Akhenaten, fabulously definitive ending and beginning. Napoleon, fabulous definitive ending and beginning. And several others in history who fit that mold. And I think the problem is we take that mold and we throw it onto a particular Roman emperor or a particular Greek politician, even though that's obviously a far more vague idea. We don't do it to a Persian king, weirdly. We don't give it Artaxerxes II. We do it Pericles, the Periclean Athens, even, which is weird because, of course, he dies in 429 BC, but Periclean Athens apparently continues to exist until the end of the Peloponnesian War, 20-something, 25 years after his death. You're like, really? That doesn't work.
Well, actually, it could be argued that all the origins of Periclean Athens are actually founded by his father, Xanthippus, and actually he barely gets a mention a lot of the time, and it's yeah.
So I think I'm going to round it all up now. I think that the idea of the end of the Persian Wars being definitive is very much a Greek thing. But even within that, with the vagaries of the dating of Eurymedon, whether there was a piece of Callias, if there was a piece of Callias, show that it's hindsight after the fact redefining of events. So there's things that I think from a Greek perspective, obviously the high watermark of the Persian Wars is Salamis, Plataea. And so, therefore, the other post-Plataean events, even the battle fought on the same day, supposedly at Mycale, and others are treated less definitively by the historians themselves. So, very hard for us to come in and assert that Eurymedon is a more definitive end to the Persian Wars than Plataea was, because the Greeks themselves don't make that point. These things keep going on. But at the same time, those things clearly show that definitive end to the Persian Wars that Plataea was supposed to be was not, because there's still battles being fought for the next sort of 20-something years. So there you have it. The end of the Persian Wars are they an end, or are they a dribble-drabble on for the next 150 years whilst Greece, finally deals with Persia only in the 420s, 320s? Oh, there you go. Well, got my centuries wrong. Thanks for joining us on another Ancient Warfare podcast. And I'd like to thank Lindsay, Mark, and of course, our silent producer in the background, Angus. Join us again for another Ancient Warfare podcast in a month's time.